Dave Meltzer joining us this week. Dave, thank you for being here as always. This coming Tuesday is a somber anniversary for wrestling fans, but I wanted to try and commemorate it by looking at some of the great things this guy did in the limited time that we had the pleasure of having Owen Hart be in wrestling. Of course, he was actually involved in it a lot longer than maybe the entire world saw, starting, of course, with his family and Stampede Wrestling, moving on to Japan, and, of course, eventually the international fame with WWF. But I wanted to just kind of go through Owen's life a little bit from that beginning point. I mean, we could go to Stampede, but where I think you probably come in the best is that transition from Stampede to Japan and then from Stampede to WWF, because it was kind of a mixed time for him where he really got an education in a totally different style when other people weren't doing anything close.
Well, he went to Europe too. I mean, he went to Europe early in his career. He went to England. I mean, he had a great match with Marty Jones there. He had tours of Germany with Advance, and obviously Japan with New Japan Pro Wrestling very early in his career, and then another run later when he was a junior heavyweight champion between WWF runs. So, but yeah, and Mexico too for UWA. Yeah. So he went all over. He went all over the world and was a star all over the world. You know, as far as as wrestling was in that era before a lot of those places kind of got engulfed. I mean, New Japan's still around, but the other promotions that we talked about as far as Otto Vance goes, that's not around. UK wrestling, that was, he was on national television in the UK. Mm-hmm. That's not around anymore. That type of, I mean, there's wrestling in the UK, and he probably still would have gone, but Stampede and the Hart brothers had a connection with the UK scene. So they got Owen over there. And yeah, I mean, but Owen was one of those guys. I mean, I remember when he first started, and Owen was good day one. I mean, very few guys, like Jun Akiyama was good day one. Kurt Angle was good day one. Owen was like that, one of those guys. The first time you saw him, it was like, oh my God, I mean, it's like, I knew he was going to be a superstar. I mean, if you ever read the stuff I wrote when he was in his first weeks, and I'm going like, dude, this guy's unbelievable. For being so, new in the business and everything. And he's only, as a worker, Owen was as good as anybody. He was, and it's, I mean, he loved it. How long he would have continued it, I don't know. It's hard to say. I do believe had he lived just a couple more years, when you had the Chris Benoits and Eddie Guerreros and Kurt Angles and all these guys coming into WWF, and the style started to change, even Dwayne and people like that, getting as far as the top spots, when you had that faster top spot thing, I think Owen would have had his best, not necessarily his best, because again, he had a match, some of his match with Davey Boy and things like that, and Bret were fantastic. But I think that Owen would have had more great matches with a more wide variety of people had that accident never happened, over the next couple of years. I think he was, the style was going more towards his direction. I don't, I could go and sit here and go, it's so sad for wrestling and this and that, but it was, with Owen, I always felt it was so sad for his kids. I really did, because, I mean, the Owen story is different from every other story in the sense that there's some culpability. I hate to say this, but there's some culpability of the guy. If a guy dies of a drug overdose, or a guy has a heart attack from doing roids and downers or whatever, right? Those guys, there is culpability of those guys. Owen, to me, there was no culpability of. I mean, it was a stunt that went wrong that he was not an expert on. And I mean, his death has been rehashed to death.
Oh yeah. And I don't even want to really focus on that more, because again, we could just re-examine the same old things, but really from a career standpoint, I think that you bring it up best there, where he was going all these places and bringing stuff that a lot of fans in North America hadn't even really seen on a regular basis. When he gets signed by the WWF for the first time, they put the hood on, they call him the Blue Blazer. Different stories have said different things. Was that his idea or their idea? Did they want to keep him away?
I don't think it was his idea. I know when I talked to him, he certainly didn't give me the impression it was his idea, because he would, I mean, I remember he would come out here and we would get together, and he joked about it. It wasn't like he cried about it. It was just like, yeah. They'll put whatever. But he wasn't happy in WWF the first time. I mean, it was like, I mean, every time I would say that, he wasn't happy. He thought he could do better. And eventually, it's hard to leave that steady money, but eventually he wanted to leave and try, go back to New Japan, which he did. And then, later he got back in and they said they would do more with him. And they eventually did. But I mean, the guy who made his career he was not doing anything spectacular until, they had the idea for the Bret feud with Bruce, and Bret basically said that Bruce is not the guy. And this is like Owen is the guy. And they were skeptical. They were skeptical of Owen because Owen had been there and Owen was not a top guy. And Bret said, we'll make it work. And they made it work. I mean, Bret and Owen did a great program. Fantastic. Some of the best matches of that era were Bret and Owen matches. And Owen was made as a star from that point forward. But it was, this was not WWE, and this was not even like fans pushing it. This was Bret. I mean, Bret is the one who deserves the credit for Owen going from just a guy in the card to being a guy who was a champion and a real star.
Well, it was such a great feud too, and some people have criticized brother versus brother feuds because they don't seem that believable. But this was a case where they did it just right, and I remember being a young fan watching this. To this day, when asked, I still say that the SummerSlam '94 cage match was my favorite match between the two of them. It's one of my favorite Bret matches, period.
One of mine too. Yeah, it's one of my favorite Bret matches. Like, the MSG match was really good, and the Iron Man match that they did was fantastic, but really fantastic. But my favorite was the cage match. Yeah.
Well, because the cage was so brutal, it was so well done. There wasn't a drop of color, there was no blood or anything like that, but you still had this intense story and just the bizarre finish with Owen hanging upside down like that. It was just spoiler alert for anybody that's never watched the match, by the way. But it's like it was just this perfect thing. And I remember even telling the story of Bret reversing the sharpshooter in the middle of the ring. Like, it was just everything in that match just crescendoed perfectly to me as a fan, and that had me hooked for the rest of my life. But when you get older and you start to understand how the partnership, the marriage of a wrestling match works, and you realize that, yes, this was Owen being put in a spot of, okay, we know you can do this. Here's your shot. And he would deliver every time.
He delivered in the ring, and he delivered as the antagonist to Bret really good, because they came up with a very believable story of Owen being jealous because here's Owen really good, and everyone knew Owen was great, but he wasn't getting the opportunities, and Bret was like the top guy or one of the top guys. So the jealousy thing, it's like there's that thread of something where it made sense, and they both played it up, and Bret did the thing, kind of like with Ray and Dominic, where he wouldn't do the match for a long, long time, right, until he's essentially forced into it. And, it was months and months before they got there. And, I mean, I think it was a real classic feud in a sense. And again, this was not a WWE idea. Pat Patterson had an idea of Bret feuding with one of his brothers, right, and feuding with Bruce. That was the WWE idea. If that doesn't happen, then what happens, and who knows, and there's so many what ifs, I mean, if you remember, Owen was very briefly in WCW, and I don't even know what happened. They were all high on him. He came in, he was going to form a tag team called Wings with Brian Pillman, and they had a couple of weeks, and then it just sort of like they kind of just fell through the cracks, and you ended up with WWF.
I'm only smiling and grinning, thinking back, sorry, to the brother versus brother storyline, because it was so brilliantly set up. They had the dissension when the brothers all teamed together at the Survivor Series, and Owen was the only one to get pinned, and he comes back and he's all upset. And then a few weeks later, building into this title match against the Quebecers, Bret and Owen are doing this promo together, and it was so ridiculously over the top, where they're like arm in arm together, and Owen goes under Bret's chin with the old fist, like the old chip off the old block thing. He's like, yeah, the Hart brothers are better than ever. And it was so perfectly done, because he was such a high good guy at that point. And then of course when the switch happens and he kicks the leg out and everything else, like, it just turns into this perfect villain. And it was just, I was a kid just gobbling it up, right? It was just so much fun to watch.
Yeah.
So anyway, when it comes down to Owen's legacy, I mean, you can go back to that feud. You can go back to the championships in Japan and the experience around the world. for those people who are like me who saw most of Owen's stuff in either Stampede or WWF, what's maybe something you could recommend? I'm sure you've got probably 4 or 5 Japanese matches you could probably rattle off instantly, but what's something that the Owen Hart fan or the fan that's learning about Owen Hart by listening to this, what's a match they should check out for sure in your mind? Do you have
Well,
one?
certainly the Muck and Singh feud was the one that really, I think, put him on the map as a star in Stampede Wrestling.
Yeah.
The feud that put him on the map as a main eventer would have been Owen Hart and Ben Bassarab against Hiroshi Hase and Fumi Nikuro, who were then called the Viet Cong Express under masks. And this is like Owen's literally only been wrestling for a very short period of time, a month or 2 or 3 or whatever. And they're doing these matches weekend, 45-minute matches and stuff. And I remember watching that. And that's also, Hase ended up being kind of like an all-time great as well. I mean, watching Owen and Hase, and they did singles matches and everything like that. So that would have been like the classic Owen. And then the classic brawl with the heat and everything like that. That's the Muck and Singh feud in Stampede. And then in Japan, Hase was the one who got him in. So you got Hase and Shiro Koshinaka, Takada, just that they had a great generation of junior heavyweights both times that Owen went there. So, a lot of the, anything, Koshinaka, Koshinaka and Hase, I would say would be like maybe his classic opponents in Japan.
Well, again, this week upcoming, the 23rd of May, the unfortunate anniversary of when we lost Owen, the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. But the stories live on, the matches are out there. And I found this fascinating when they did the Dark Side of the Ring episode. And
that's the highest rated episode of any show in the history of the Vice Network is the Dark Side with Owen.
Yeah.
But the highest.
For everybody that was clamoring for Owen to be in the Hall of Fame, if you haven't watched that show, it makes 100% perfect sense to me. And I say that being someone who's friends with the family on both sides today, where if that's their will, that's their way, and that's the way it's going to be.
I understand Martha's position completely, and always have.
Yeah.
I mean, she had her, and I, I always talk about it. Mike Tenay and I had long discussions about Martha Hart, and we just have all the respect in the world because there's in that situation, there's 2 things she could have done, and one was just collapse. And I think a lot of people would have done that, and she rose above it. She rose above it, and she made, she used Owen's name for the greater good, and her kids turned out great. And they'll never be able to get that back what they lost, but from a community standpoint, what they've done, Owen's name has been, I think that she's really elevated Owen's name as far as enduring as something far more, we know about Owen far more than, oh yeah, he was a really good technical wrestler. Yeah. He was a great guy. And the Dark Side, I really am, that to me, of all the things the Dark Side has done, they've done some great stories where you learn a lot, but this is the one where I think when you watch it, where you just, it shows something about the human spirit, and she's a real hero. I mean, I believe that she's a real hero.
And to say that if you're a fan and you want to see Owen in a WWE Hall of Fame, and that's what you want to see, you're not wrong for wanting that either.
He's in Hall of Fames. I mean, he's in the Waterloo Hall of Fame, which is in many ways, to a lot of people, the more prestigious of the two. I'm sure that to his family, it may be. I know Bret had told me that, like the Waterloo Hall of Fame was the one that he was the most proud of, because he said that's the one with Luthez and Karl Gotch and, you know what I mean? The guys who he looked up to, as opposed to the WWE Hall of Fame, which was, nothing against it. It's just, just something different. But,
but I guess what I'm saying is that people will argue about anything in wrestling, even something like Owen Hart being in the Hall of Fame. What we're allowed to do now with the Owen Hart Foundation, with the tournament they've been doing in AEW, with the stories that Bret tells on the road, or if you get the chance to just hang with him for a while, and Owen's story is going to come up, you and I talking about his career here. There are so many ways that we can celebrate and remember Owen Hart. And Dave, I want to thank you for helping us do that this week, because he was a guy that I only met a couple of times. And one of the times I was that kid trying to get into the business, and he was the most direct with me ever. And he said to me flat out, like, just be careful, because there's going to be a lot of people that are going to promise things that, they're going to want your money, and they'll take your money and you'll get nothing out of it. And so really do your research. And he even went as far as to like warn me by names in some cases, which I won't go into here, but in a 10-minute conversation, it's like any kid walks up to a wrestler and says, what do I got to do to be a wrestler? They'll be like, just go train, or here, call my buddy, and they'll get bilked out for a couple grand and whatever. But Owen was so clear. And I tell this story all the time because it was my one real in-depth interaction with him, from a fan to a wrestler. I was actually there as an interviewer. It was my first wrestling interview was Bret, Owen, and Davey together.
Wow.
And yeah, right. Like, no pressure. Right. And after we did the interview, I asked him, I said, what does it take? And he gave me the best advice that I still carry to this day. Watch out for people that promise a lot of BS, because they're probably full of it. So, so thank you for taking the time, Dave, to talk about Owen Hart this week. And for all the fans out there, let's use this week. Let's watch some of those matches Dave talked about. And Dave, I know you're gone next week, so we'll catch you again a couple weeks here.
Okay, cool. Have a great time.